Welcome to the D&D Fitness Radio Podcast, brought to you by your hosts, Don Saladino from New York City and Derek Hansen from Vancouver, Canada. In episode 31, we welcome gut and brain health expert and author, Dr. David Perlmutter.
So I'm introducing right now someone I've been following for many years, Dr. David Perlmutter, the author of Grain Brain and Brain Maker. First off, thank you for coming down.
I am so delighted to be here. I love being in New York. It's great.
I don't know how you can love being in New York, but no, it's a love-hate. I have a love-hate with the city for things that we can obviously jump in on. But you're really kind of, anytime I have a customer or client come into me and they're asking me about how to get from point A to point B, I almost always feel like the first thing I'm talking about is you. Ironically,
thank you.
Well, it sounds weird and it sounds funny, but
am I like an Uber driver?
No, but in all seriousness, people come to me for fitness advice, and they come to me for lifestyle change. And the first thing I'm dialing in really on is sleep, digestion, and brain function. Even if someone's coming to me who wants to look like a superhero, I'm still talking about sleep, digestion, and brain function. You've been doing this for decades. Has this gone in the path that you imagined it to go in? Because I really feel like this has morphed into something pretty special.
I wouldn't say exactly. So we wrote Grain Brain published it 5 years ago, wrote it obviously before that, and the 5-year anniversary revision comes out pretty soon. And I would say that the major tenets of that book have been hugely validated, and that is that we need to change our diets back to the way people have eaten for as long as hominids have been on the planet. More fat. What did I just say? Who knew? Higher, watching the protein, but more protein in relation to carbohydrates. And beyond that, those lifestyle issues that you mentioned are not getting any attention to this day. Our general lack of quality sleep on the planet is affecting our health overall in terms of risk for things like diabetes for sure. Lack of sleep immediately affects the way your cells respond to the hormone insulin the next day.
Right.
And if we have time, we'll talk about why that is the cornerstone of so many of our dreaded diseases. But I think that it is always a work in progress. Were we 100% 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Nope. I always get a kick out. There's an online criticism of Dr. Perlmutter that I read from time to time to make me feel good. And the man says, how can you believe Dr. Perlmutter when 10 years ago he said this and now he's changed his messaging?
Yeah, but I think that's common with anyone who's great in their industry. I was talking to Dr. Greg Rose out of TPI, and the things he was preaching 15 years ago is not what he's preaching now. And Mike Boyle, strength coaches will be like, yeah, I was changed my way of thinking.
Exactly, and that's what you want me to do.
Right.
You want me to keep my finger on the pulse of the literature and modify the messaging as we move forward to give you the most up-to-date, relevant, and applicable recommendations that you do the same thing, right?
Right.
The messaging changes with time. That should absolutely not be a point of criticism. It should be a point of satisfaction, of actually support that this guy or girl is staying on top of the science and changing the messaging as we move forward. That's what you want.
Totally agree. One thing is, you said fat, high fat. And I remember in the early 80s, we were in that era of the snack wells. Remember where everything was coming out with 1,000 ingredients in it and low fat and low sugar and yet all this crap in it. I always bring this up because I'm trying to show people that I'm trying to meld the world of brain function, health, hormones, what's most important, how our body, how our engine runs with, why not look good with our shirt off? There is always this vanity component that I think society has.
The vanity component actually is motivating. And so in that regard, I won't derogate it. I will indicate that if it moves you to leveraging this information for a positive outcome, I'm there.
Okay.
And why not? But I will say that, and I think it's very important being here with both of you today, that the notion of people really diving into exercise as their salvation and hope that they're going to have outcomes in the areas of weight loss, of better feeling, of looking better, etc., I think it has to be analyzed in the broader context of all of the areas, whether it's sleep, diet, etc., that you look at. That said, I've said before, you can't exercise away a crappy diet. You can't do it. And you go to the gym and you see, lots of people doing their best to exercise away their indiscretions the night before, and it doesn't work that way. I would say it's far more important for you to eat right, get some exercise. You don't have to overdo it.
Break a sweat.
You bet. And these people who kill themselves in the gym out of guilt for their previous day's dietary engagement, that's not the best way to do it.
Yeah, and it seems like the exercise industry is feeding into that, for lack of a better word, but we're going to make it intense. You're going to come here and you're going to just kill yourself. And people are like, yeah, that's what I need.
Yeah, but unfortunately, as a society, and I'm not talking about strength coaches like ourselves, society dictates success by this Rocky mentality. One of my favorite movies of all time, but one of the worst messages and examples that we can give people, because they're under the assumption that unless they are vomiting and unless they are dying, well, why start? And they think differently like we do. When I was just at Comic-Con speaking, everyone in the crowd asked me a question. They're like, yeah, but it's hard, and when I go to the gym, I leave feeling like I'm going to collapse. And well, what do? I'm like, start with 10 minutes. Don't leave the gym feeling like you're going to collapse. If you feel like you can only go 50% intensity, go 50% intensity. Establish some habit, establish some consistency and some confidence, and then build from there. You're 100% correct. I mean, I feel like a lot of times people are trying to go and race a car on a NASCAR track, and the engine is just not ready to compete.
Yeah, I always tell people, the hardest part about an exercise program is day one, just getting started. I remember when I trained with a friend from high school, and then years later we decided we'd run a marathon. He said, I just want to finish the race. I don't care what my time is. I said, I just want to start it. I just want to, be there on the starting line that day, come what may, meaning get through it without injury and be ready to do this thing. But I'm sure both of you have had this feeling where you see people either on the street or at the gym, and you feel like overstepping your bounds and saying, look, first thing, you need to change your diet. You need to what you're eating is not, even though it's diet this and diet that, artificially sweetened, let me spend 5 minutes with you. And, of course, people are, you're a total stranger on the street, but I just wish people could embrace that message, and it's very challenging.
I always say small change, and you've got to know as a coach who you're working with. Because you very easily, even as a nutritionist, a doctor, you can ruin someone if you come in on day one and you throw too much at them. Yeah. They lose that confidence. And what I found works great, and I'm hoping a lot of our listeners can learn from this, is let's take something that might be very easy to fix, and let's just take the next few weeks being consistent with it, being good at it, still screwing up, still making mistakes, but maybe improving it by 80%.
We had this conversation today, and that was to embrace your mistakes. And that, wasn't it Thomas Edison has said he learned more from his 99 failures than his one success. But I would say that as I in one of the public television specials I did, talked about how, it'd be great if you could get out and walk 2 or 3 miles a day. But maybe you're only going to walk from your house to the end of your driveway to the mailbox. Maybe that's your first step, because you haven't been able to do that.
But if you do that every day, think about how much more active in the next 365 days you're going to be.
And the next day you do it twice. And you do 10 push-ups today. And tomorrow you do 11.
We got to dive into a topic right now, because I'm excited to get into it. I know this is your specialty, but the ketogenic diet. And you and I spoke about this at the Garden of Life Summit, I think years ago when I first met you and first listened to you speak. And what I respected about you was you obviously know every intrinsic little thing about how the ketogenic diet can benefit someone, but you also understand that a specific person should or shouldn't be doing it. Have you noticed that keto is something where, and I want you to explain what keto is to our listener, because I think a lot of people don't really understand this, but do a lot of people use this as a tool of yo-yo dieting? I don't know what people do, but I would think it's quite likely some people do keto for a while and then go back to their old habits. But
But let's get back to the notion of what is the keto diet. And it's basically, for most people, it is recalibrating their metabolism away from burning sugar or breaking down carbohydrate into sugar as a fuel and starting to use fat as a fuel for the body. And it gets back to something you said earlier, how, years ago, fat was the enemy.
Right.
Which runs into headlong into great contrast with what humans have sustained humans for as long as we've been on the planet. It wasn't carbs. Hunter-gatherers didn't hunt Doritos and gather them up. That's not where they came from. So, the idea is to power your body with what it has always been powered with, and that is primarily this wonderful fuel source, and that is fat. But which is so typical of human physiology as we learn more about it. Things don't do just one thing. Like we'd like to think that progesterone, the female hormone progesterone, is called pro, meaning for, gest, meaning gestation. Well, so it's a hormone that we named progesterone because it's involved in gestation. Well, it has receptors in the brain. It's present in males. So we get locked into trying to just think that these physiologic activities do one thing. And so it is with burning fat as well. When the body is burning fat and creates chemicals called ketones, it's a much bigger issue than just giving the body fat as a fuel. What we now understand, so again, getting on a ketogenic diet is a diet that promotes your body's production of these chemicals called ketones when we burn dietary fat and body fat as well. That's what the ketogenic diet is. How we get there, etc., we'll hopefully have time to talk about. But I want to say that the production of these ketones, we now understand, is far more exciting than just powering your body with a superfuel. These ketones, and specifically one that we call betahydroxybutyrate, which is produced when you're on a ketogenic diet, is what we call a signaling molecule. And what does that mean? It means it binds to cells and it changes the expression of your DNA. Holy Toledo, that's pretty amazing. That by going on this diet, you're changing the expression of your DNA, your life code, that until a few years ago we thought was pretty locked in a glass case that determined everything about who Don would be, what you would look like. We changed the expression of our life code by making dietary changes. In this case, going on a ketogenic diet, turning on genes that increase our antioxidant production, that decrease inflammation, that actually increase the production of a chemical that makes your brain grow new brain cells. So beyond the fact that you're going to feel great, it'll be great for weight loss, energy improves, your cognitive function improves, but you're paving the way to a healthier and longer life.
Right.
By going back to what our ancestors did.
Is there anything negative that you believe? So it's interesting because you'll speak to different doctors and different nutritionists, and they all have their 2 cents on this, and they'll discuss, well, there's no carbohydrates, and for someone who's in hormonal distress, might need carbohydrates to help repair their hormones. And do you find, is there anything negative that you can pinpoint out of the ketogenic diet? Because you seem like you're
nothing's 100%. And I think that clearly some people who engage ketogenic diet from the outset have difficulties transitioning or becoming what we call keto adapted.
Right.
And in some people that's 2 or 3 days and they're done with it. For others it may take a couple of weeks, where your body is desperate for powering itself with carbs because that's what it's always done, and suddenly you withdraw those carbohydrates and there's a hashtag, what the heck is going on here? We'll leave it at that, where your body is saying, you took my fuel away. And so people get a little shaky. Early on, they become a little bit mineral deprived, which is very, very common. But when people keto adapt, their sleep is better, their sex drive is better, they lose that weight that they could never lose. Everything seems to improve. Nothing is 100%. Are there people who shouldn't be on a ketogenic diet? Well, I think people who have end-stage kidney disease may not be able to fully process ketones. or even moderate kidney disease. I think this is the disclaimer where if you're thinking this, you should check with your healthcare provider to determine if it's right for you. I think brittle type 1 diabetics should be careful with this. We know that this is by far and away, and I'll say it on your podcast, the best treatment for type 2 diabetes ever discovered. Better than any pharmaceutical, as Dr. Sarah Hallberg demonstrated in a couple of her studies that are published. Incredible increase in insulin sensitivity, an incredible decrease in this elusive A1C. You see the commercials on television, take this drug and your A1C will go down, but you're still overweight. Look at these commercials. These are people who are significantly overweight, and that has its own set of issues related to risk in terms of heart disease, cognitive failure, etc. So it's not just lowering your A1C. You can't just target that with a drug and think that you've solved the problem.
Right.
You're not treating your diabetes by taking these drugs. And yet the television advertisers say, treat your diabetes, lower your A1C by taking X, Y, Z.
It's a Band-Aid.
Well, it's even worse than a Band-Aid. It is just targeting the A1C, leaving the diabetes unchecked. You stop the drug, the next morning, oh, I'm still diabetic.
What about cancer? What about Alzheimer's? I mean, there's certain research that I've read stating that it can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, which I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. Or
well, I think we know that the retrospective studies do demonstrate that individuals who favor fat in their diets, there was a Dr. Rosebud Roberts at the Mayo Clinic publishing in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, who demonstrated that when you look at what people ate, that those people favoring a higher carbohydrate diet had about an 88% increased risk for developing dementia, whereas those who favored fat as their primary fuel source, caloric source, had about a 44% decreased risk for a disease for which there is no treatment. Now, I want to take a deep breath here. For a disease for which there is no treatment, affecting more than 5 million Americans today, that number is going to double by the year 2030, costing America $250 billion annually, costing more than $1 trillion globally, higher than the market value of Google, right at the market value, I guess, of Apple. But that said, this is a global epidemic for which there is no treatment today, as you and I, the three of us, have this conversation. There's no treatment for it whatsoever, and yet dietary changes are associated with reduced risk. Why in the heck wouldn't you pursue that? Beyond the fact that you're going to feel better, your athletic performance will improve, your sleep will improve, you're going to lose the weight, you'll reduce your risk of cancer, we'll talk about that in just a moment, improve your insulin sensitivity, etc. But it's associated with reduced risk of Alzheimer's, for which there is no treatment. John Kennedy said, the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. So, for your podcast audience, why would you not do this? I mean, it's a plea.
I think also out there, from the information I've gathered, there's a lot of people who think they're in ketosis aren't necessarily in ketosis. They're almost doing like a modified Atkins diet, or their protein might be too high. But it is difficult. I mean, I tried it a few years ago, and I was thinking the other day that I jump into it. I think I said to Derek today, I jump into ketosis every year. I haven't done it this year. But a couple years ago, I went and did it, and I remember my body, I remember what happened to my body physically. I remember how hard it was for me to get into ketosis. And I'm very dialed in with like my macros and all this stuff. But the typical, our population out there, I don't think they're not gonna, it's hard. It's very hard.
Here's the exciting news. I mentioned earlier that when you're in ketosis, your body produces beta-hydroxybutyrate, and that's key. That beta-hydroxybutyrate is what you want to have floating around. It's great for your brain. It changes gene expression. It targets these what are called G protein receptors on cells that are involved in changing what the cell can do. So the way to get higher levels of beta-hydroxybutyrate classically has been what happens in starvation, it happens when you fast, it happens when you're on a strict ketogenic diet. But if you just take some MCT oil, your body will produce beta-hydroxybutyrate even though you haven't cut back on your carbohydrates. So you don't have to be in deep ketosis to reap the benefits of this amazing chemical beta-hydroxybutyrate.
Well, MCT oil, would you categorize that as a supplement, a food? What would you really categorize?
Well, it's not a food, although there are foods that have high levels of it. One of the richest sources of MCT, human breast milk.
Right, I would say...
Not that should be what everyone...
Derek, take it easy.
Easy. But no, my point is, though, think about that. That infants, for the first 6 months of their lives who are breastfeeding, are in ketosis. Right. Because they're growing a brain.
And not to sound like a salesperson here, but the MCT oil that I use of choice is the Garden of Life. It's a doctor formulated line, right? The MCT
I took 2 tablespoons this morning.
Right.
And I hope I'm making sense here today.
Right, no, you make perfect sense.
Am I with the program?
I've been almost doing a tablespoon with every meal.
Yeah.
So I don't even know.
I generally take, I'm on the road, so I don't have access. But at home, I take it all day long.
You should have some downstairs.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have some more. But, for me, I don't eat until about 2 in the afternoon. And I just, now this is an N of 1. I'm very productive. I can go to the gym, do my whole program. I can write, I can do podcasts and everything. And I just think that it works for me. Am I saying everyone should do that? No. My fasting blood sugar is about 67. Is that low? Yeah, it's low. Is it too low for many people? Probably. Is it okay for me? Works for me.
Do you believe that people should be getting back onto a higher protein, higher carbohydrate diet at specific increments or intervals throughout the year, whatever you might want to call it, to almost adapt to carbs now? I mean, one thing I've seen is high carb diets have worked for me in the past, but after a period of time, it doesn't work for me.
I think we need to, you do a little hacking of your own physiology, and I think more than just looking at the metrics of how do you feel, how productive am I, because, if you happen to be having you have a cold or a virus on board that you're not really aware of, you might associate this new change, whatever that may be, with feeling better or feeling worse, and it may not be, there are variables here that you might not have considered. What I'm saying is, it's good to check your blood sugar, to check your ketone level, to check a lot of different parameters at various times under various conditions of dietary choice to see how it's affecting you in terms of data that you can achieve on your own.
What's the best way to check it? Is it through a little prick, a little finger prick?
I use pinprick, and the reason I do that is in terms of testing ketones. There are really 3 ways: breath, blood, and urine. Breath doesn't actually measure beta-hydroxybutyrate, it measures acetone, which is another ketone that is produced, and you infer your level of ketosis based upon acetone and infer your level of beta-hydroxybutyrate. The downside of that technology is it's not totally convenient, although you'd think it's a simple breathalyzer, you blow into a tube and etc. But you have to wait till the device warms up, and it takes several minutes, etc. Urine is a good measure with a dipstick and measuring acetoacetate, again, not specifically measuring beta-hydroxybutyrate, and that is fully dependent on the function that day of your kidneys. Did the ketones in your blood make it through the gate and then come out in the urine, and you test that? I test blood because it measures both directly beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is what I'm interested in, and also my blood sugar at the same time, which I'm very, very interested in.
Can you explain more about the beta-hydroxybutyrate and the importance of its function? I know a big word that we've been hearing over the last couple of years is, and I know you've been hearing it forever, but it's mitochondria, and how we want to pretty much reproduce mitochondria, right? The more mitochondria we have, the healthier mitochondria we have, the better off our brain function is going to be, and our overall vitality. And I kind of refer to mitochondria as like our power plant, correct? I mean, is that how you would?
Yeah, that's true, but so much more than that.
Please, I want to hear.
So we all learned in biology that the mitochondria are the energy producers of the cell. But as we move forward, we're learning so much more about these mitochondria that they actually exert influence over the regular cell's DNA. That these up to 1,000 in a cell, mitochondria floating around, which were eons ago free living bacteria, Yes, they are involved in taking fuel and making energy out of fuel. We all learn that. But they produce their own peptides that are active in the cell. They also regulate the DNA to some degree of the cell itself. And it turns out that cells have within them a program for cell death, which is actually a good thing. It's called apoptosis. And we need cells that are defective, for example, to die off. For example, we would like cancer cells to die. And even in our ontogeny, meaning the development of the human from the embryo to the infant, etc., to the rest of our lives, but in the development of the embryo, we start out with limb buds, like paddles, like a seal. And what happens is the cells between the digits die off through this process of apoptosis. It's programmed in the cell to die. Then we get our digits. So it's actually a good thing that cells die, and the mitochondria are controlling that. When the mitochondria sense, for whatever reason, there's something wrong with the cell, or they themselves are defective, they will initiate this program where the cell will die. And that's very cool, because there's certain cells we don't want to have around. We try, our physiology tries to engage this process to get rid of defective cells. Similarly, the mitochondria themselves, when they are defective, undergo a process where they destroy themselves called mitophagy, which is breathtaking. That process is fundamentally important, because if they don't get rid of themselves, then we replicate these mitochondria that are ineffective. And what does that turn out? What does it look like? Well, when your energy production fails, you don't think straight. Mitochondria are at the center of Alzheimer's research. So when mitochondria begin to fail, whatever they're powering begins to fail. Lyme disease is a classic mitochondropathy, a disease that targets the mitochondria. Why is it that people with Lyme disease have generalized fatigue, have cognitive issues? It's because their mitochondria aren't working. Getting back to our topic, so we got to do everything we possibly can to turn on how our mitochondria function. And if their primary role is energy, the very best fuel we can put in the furnace is fat, and specifically ketones. It's been called by Dr. George Cahill, one of the original researchers in this whole area, the superfuel.
Are you, is it as vague as there's a certain amount of fat you recommend each individual consuming according to their body weight? Is that a...
And then I want to ask some questions about athletes, because it's different, right? Well, it's not different, but there's three things I want to ask you about athletes. One is energy production, 2, inflammation, especially if you're an NFL player, and 3 is just connective tissue health, because those are the things I'm always worried about, injuries. But when I was first introduced to this concept from an athlete point of view, there was a triathlon coach, and he was talking about, you've got this fuel truck, and the truck has gas for itself, but it's carrying this tanker of gas, and we're trying to access that tank, switch from fuel sources for endurance athletes. So what is the process happening there to help endurance athletes?
Did I hear process?
Yeah. You used that downstairs and you didn't pick up on it.
Oh, what do you know?
My favorite word he says.
I'm actually a Canadian resident now, just so you know.
Awesome.
Well, there you go. Hey.
Congratulations.
Happy Thanksgiving.
There you go. Happy Thanksgiving. Well, let me answer Don's question first. And there are no strict guidelines. And I think that gets us to the place of personalized medicine. What does that individual need based upon his or her genome, microbiome, current biometrics, blood sugar, etc.? How do you specifically cultivate a program for the individual? Globally, people need higher fat and less carbohydrate in their diets. The protein aspect of it, we don't want to go, no pun intended, hog wild. Maybe pun intended a little bit. Always slip those guys in. When you overdo the protein, you create a scenario where you're actually creating glucose by breaking down protein and using that as a fuel source. So we don't want to do too much protein. Now, we cultivate these programs based upon if this person's a competitive bodybuilder or is in the gym lifting weights and perhaps might need more protein to build muscle if that's her or his goal. Now, you brought up 3 points, and let me first talk about the inflammation part of the story. as mentioned earlier, this beta-hydroxybutyrate is very powerful in terms of targeting gene pathways that help to reduce inflammation. And certainly in a contact sport, or any sport that is going to really be taxing on your body, which by definition almost is most sports, you run the risk of increasing inflammation. Why is that an issue? It's because the inflammation that you might create in your legs by doing squats is not going to stay in your legs. Those inflammatory chemicals circulate throughout the body, will influence heart health, risk for diabetes, risk for cancer, and even brain health. So that's the dirty little downside of over-exercising or being involved in sports that are really very taxing like that. So it's not just that, well, you know, we had a big game on Sunday, I got beat up, I'll pop a couple of ibuprofens and start training again on Tuesday, take Monday off. It is more pernicious than that, and I think it's really a great conversation to have. That we all create inflammation. It's not a bad thing to some degree because it helps us deal with trauma. It helps us deal with bacterial invaders, for example, and other issues in our bodies. It's our mechanism to deal with that. But when it's unbridled, when it's unchecked, runaway inflammation is the cornerstone of our most dreaded chronic degenerative conditions. The coronary artery disease, the Alzheimer's, the cancer, diabetes, those conditions that the World Health Organization now characterizes as being the #1 cause of death on planet Earth, the chronic degenerative inflammatory conditions. So you bring up a really good point, and that is the importance of inflammation well beyond the athletes that you're training. Inflammation can be something that's extremely active in somebody who never lifts a finger. You can be totally sedentary, and in fact that increases inflammation. The chemicals that mediate inflammation have their their origin in body fat. We did call them cytokines, but they're actually adipokines, coming from adipose tissue. So these terrible mediators of inflammation that go by the name of things like interleukin-1 beta, tumor necrosis factor alpha, etc., come from body fat. So there's a direct relationship between the level of those mediators of inflammation and the amount of what we call visceral fat that a person has. Levels of inflammation are much greater when people have higher blood sugar. And one of the mechanisms gets back to a conversation we had earlier, and that is when sugar floating around in your bloodstream binds to protein, we call that glycation. All of the proteins in your body can bind sugar. They can be glycated. When they are glycated or bound to sugar, it changes the three-dimensional appearance of that protein, and your immune system doesn't like that, and that instigates inflammation. One of the proteins that bind sugar is hemoglobin. That's the protein in your red blood cells that carries oxygen. And when it's glycated, we call it, that's hemoglobin A1C. So this hemoglobin A1C is what everybody talks about. I'm going to lower my A1C tomorrow because I'm taking this drug. But it doesn't target all of the other things that the elevated glucose does, nor the more upstream issues that are going on with these people.
Is that the only way to be able to measure if you're like someone wants to find out if they're too inflamed? I know it's about where we're putting it, but how do you find out if you have too much inflammation in your body?
Well, it's a terrific question. Let's talk about the A1C for just a moment. A1C is an extremely powerful way of determining your level of blood sugar control, the activity of your insulin, and as mentioned, inflammation. Higher A1C is perfectly correlated with higher levels of inflammation. The higher your A1C, the higher is the rate of annual shrinkage of your brain. Okay, I want to lower A1C, right?
Sign me up, yeah.
But here's the part that is so disturbing is in the doctor's office, you can only have your A1C checked and covered by insurance generally if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic. I want to know right now. For God's sakes. But so anyway, so that's a sort of quasi-indirect measurement of inflammation. You can be more specific and measure what I have mentioned before. You measure your tumor necrosis factor alpha or interleukin-1 beta or other measurements of inflammation or not. Some of those cytokines actually, or interleukins, act by reducing inflammation. And looking at the ratios, I think, is very, very helpful. But that said, great. If you don't want to involve yourself in that technology, here is the way to reduce inflammation in your body, and you can start this tomorrow morning. You want to eat more healthful fat, and we should probably define that, and less carbohydrate. We should define what that means as well.
Sure. Man, there's a million directions I can go with this right now. So you just said more helpful fat. There was an article out just recently saying how coconut oil is poison. And I want to get your opinion on that. I know you're probably going to be against that, but there's always controversy. There's always someone trying to say that something's bad that for years we've been doing. And whether it's true or not, you're taking something like coconut oil, which is I cook with. I know we can get medium chain triglycerides from that coconut oil. Do you have any instant feedback on that comment? Is that completely false, or is there?
Well, here's why coconut oil was talked about as being just so horrible, and you shouldn't go near it, or your children will be born naked. And it is because it's 90% saturated fat. We all know that saturated fat is a terrible thing. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Why would 50% of the fat in human breast milk be saturated fat?
Right.
The beauty of saturated fat is, first of all, by its nature, being saturated means it cannot be oxidized, means it can't be damaged by free radicals.
Right.
Why antioxidants are good. Saturated fat is fundamentally important for your brain to function appropriately. So the way that castigation of coconut oil happened was through that channel of its high in saturated fat. That there is no evidence to support an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in people consuming high levels of saturated fat. Maybe I'll say that again. There is no evidence that consuming higher levels of saturated fat is associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Now that flies in the face of all that we've been told over the years, mostly in terms of commercials.
You know, is it the saturated fat that forced someone to be 400 pounds, or was it the excessive sugar? or the white flour and the lack of nutrients that they consumed with that saturated fat? So I think, as you said, the studies are inconclusive, and I mean, I know personally there is some value to what it does for hormone function, correct? I mean,
no question.
Yeah, okay.
We need saturated fat. It's fundamentally important for the cell wall, the cell membrane.
But on top of that, I use it as a tool for keeping people satiated.
Absolutely.
And one of the biggest tricks and the problem that we have in New York City is every finance man or woman has to go to their dinner that night, and they're around, food, and they're around really good food, and they're around alcohol, and when they're not satiated up until that period of time, it's a recipe for disaster. And I tell people, well, I'm always craving junk. I'm saying you're craving junk because you're not eating enough. You don't have the proper nutrients. You don't have maybe enough fat in your diet. Well, what do? I'm giving them a little meal, and I'm upping their fat almost 2 hours before they go to dinner, and they're finding out that they're satiated. They're not making bad food choices. What is the relationship between the brain and when you're undernourishing the body? I mean, I almost know, I know the answer to this, but I want you to explain it because
What is the relationship between the brain and undernourishing the body? Well, let's take it back a couple of notches. And what does sugar tell the body? Sugar is telling the body that we're about to enter a period of caloric scarcity. What do I mean by that? And going back to our hunter-gatherer times, sugar is a signal that says winter is coming, because in Paleolithic times, the only time we would have sugar was when the fruit ripened. The wild blueberries would ripen, we would eat them because they were sweet, or blackberries, which we found everywhere this summer in British Columbia. But it signals your body winter's coming. It changes your gut bacteria to tell your body to make and store fat. It also works through the hormone insulin, which is far more active in the body than simply dealing with blood sugar. We know that everybody thinks insulin's involved in blood sugar processing. Well, of course it is. But insulin tells the body that winter is coming through this signaling mechanism saying, become lipogenic, make fat, and whatever fat you have, it'll lock it up so you don't have access to it. That's exactly what we don't want for most people. Most people want to burn their body fat, and cut their consumption of carbohydrates to make that happen. So, the effects on the brain work through other appetite signaling mechanisms called leptin and ghrelin, and these are absolutely tied into this notion of what fat signaling versus sugar signaling will do. And I want to get to another point that you raised, and that is we don't want to castigate carbohydrates globally, because some of our most important foods are carbohydrate based. These are the dietary fiber-rich foods that we need to consume. And this is a big problem that people get into when they say, I'm going to cut out my carbs and go on a ketogenic diet. Okay, but before you do that, you kind of need to understand how to do it. And the biggest problem I think people get into is constipation. They get constipated, 2-3 days go by and they haven't had a bowel movement. They say, I'm not getting involved. This is ridiculous. I want to purge my body. They get into that situation because they've cut out the fiber-rich foods, which are by definition carbs. And you need those fiber-rich foods to bulk up your stool, to nurture your gut bacteria, and to allow things to move through you. So, that's certainly one of the very important caveats.
Can you still be in ketosis and consume a minimal amount of carbohydrates, say around activity or workout time?
You can.
So I've spoken to a couple of people who've been doing it for a while, and now they're starting to play with it and tamper with it a little bit. And they're like, well, I was actually able to go and consume this, and I was still in ketosis. So I've always been told that there's importance around workout time of making sure that you're replenishing loss of glycogen. Is that false? Is that something you don't believe in?
Well, I mean, it gets back to Derek's question about, I think you mentioned endurance athletes.
Yes.
And so we should talk about that. But first, again, it's important to think about that individual, what his or her particular needs are based upon their heritage, based upon their current body type, and based upon the activity level that they're engaging. I do feel that you can be I don't know when we're talking about endurance athletes, are we half marathon versus a full marathon? And actually it's important because you can run a half marathon and basically burn your glycogen stores and not need any gels and things like that. But after about that length of time, which is whatever length it is for people, an hour and a half if you're older, or 2 hours for me, but by that point you're pretty well done with your glycogen, and now you're needing to shift over to your body's looking for a fuel source. If you are keto adapted, you have 10-fold the availability of calories by virtue of your body fat.
Right.
You can tap right into that, and our ancestors were distance athletes, and so you're able to tap into that. So I guess it really, it certainly depends on the level of training and the level of adaptation that person's physiology has had to mobilize fat as a fuel source.
Okay.
A couple of good books. One is Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It by Gary Taubes. That outlines all of the science in an understandable way about this insulin signaling that we've talked about. Dr. Mark Hyman wrote a book called Eat Fat, Get Thin, which sounds like the most glaring paradox challenging everything we've been told, but we used to think calories in, calories out. That if you take in 2,000 calories, but you burn 3,000 calories, you're going to lose weight. But it doesn't work that way, because there are plenty of people who do that. And doc, I swear to you, I'm only taking in 2,000 calories a day, but I can't lose weight. And there's so many reasons for that, not the least of which is what you're doing to your gut bacteria. When you consume artificial sweeteners, 0 calories, 0 sugar, it dramatically increases your risk for obesity and diabetes by drinking diet soda, which flies in the face of everything the advertisers will tell you. But these are well-published studies. They're interventional trials that give laboratory animals and humans these artificial sweeteners and look at what happens to their blood sugars and their markers for diabetes.
Wow.
It's very sad.
No. It is, and I know we can continue on this conversation for another 5 hours.
Good. What time we got?
You've been incredibly gracious with your time. There's really 2 more questions I want to ask. One is really kind of a basic question of if someone's interested in starting the ketogenic diet, what is the best route to send them on so they can say this? I'm curious to giving it a go. How would you recommend me to go about doing it?
I would go to my website,
okay,
which is drperlmutter.com.
Okay.
And we have a whole keto guide there. We've collected all the information about why it's important, how to do it, the foods to eat, the supplements to take, what you need to watch out for, what are the pitfalls. So I would just direct people there. That's totally free and available to anyone.
And my next question, which you'll be able to run with this for about 5 hours, but just to kind of simplify this, if you look at the word if you look at the word microbiome in the dictionary, your name's next to it. I mean, it literally is when I think.
I'm glad it's on my picture. God, here's one of your bacteria.
No, I mean,
looks like me.
I learned about the microbiome from you, pretty much in the last probably 5-6 years. So, could you explain the importance of the microbiome? Can you explain what it is and why people should be paying attention to that?
So, the term microbiome, I think, is almost universally misused. People say, well, I'm taking this because it's good for my microbiome, thinking that the microbiome is a term that relates to the bacteria that live in the gut, and it is not. The microbiome is a global term that deals, yes, with the bacteria that live in your gut, or on your skin, on your person, in your person, but also it encompasses their DNA, or rather RNA, their genetic material, as it were, and also their metabolic process and what they create. So the various vitamins that they produce, the short chain fatty acids that they produce. So it's a very global term when we say microbiome in the scientific way. That's what we're talking about. It's the big picture. But I think that what people might want to focus on would be more the gut microbiota. And that means the bugs that live in your gut. And generally, although it's a bit myopic, people are talking about the bacteria that live within the gut. These days, we're learning that there are bacterial viruses. In other words, viruses that attach themselves to the bacteria. We call these bacteriophages, that really play an important role in regulating the activity of our gut bacteria and the metabolic products that they end up producing. So, but by and large, this is science that is evolving at an incredible rate. That 10 years ago, if you had looked in the medical research for articles that talked about what the gut bacteria do, you'd find almost nothing. So it's exploding. That rather than thinking of these bugs as germs, which has a negative connotation, and we think back to the work of Pasteur, the germ theory, that lurking are all these bacteria that are out there to get you, and they're in your body, on your body, they're just waiting for you to have spend the night out and not sleep and drink too much, and they're going to seize that opportunity to make you sick. Well, the reality is almost all of the organisms living on your body and in your body are there because you're their home, and they want to do everything they can to keep you healthy. You're feeding them, you're housing them. Why would they shoot themselves and shoot you in the foot? So what I say to people is, when women are pregnant, we say, you've got to be careful now, you're eating for 2, but we should all be careful what we eat because we're eating for 100 trillion. They eat what you eat. If you eat crap, they're not happy, and they start producing products that are not good for your health. They start changing your risk for metabolic issues like diabetes and weight gain. But when you treat them right, when you give them what they want, they're just saying, oh, I love this girl, I love this guy, I'm going to do everything I can to keep them healthy.
But it seems like the yogurt industry is kind of glommed onto this, and it's not that simple, is it? Just to eat yogurt.
Well, by and large, most commercial yogurt is very high in sugar. So, I mean, it's dichotomy it's a paradox in a can. Because you get this jar of yogurt with live cultures, and you think, oh my gosh, I've heard about the microbiome, I'm going to just eat this yogurt, and the next thing you know, I'm going to be president of the World Bank. Well, it doesn't work that way, because at the same time, you got that layer on the bottom, oh, it's fruit. Well, it's not fruit. If it were fruit, it would rot.
Yeah.
So it's this, it's preserved with
2 years.
3 or 4 teaspoons of sugar. You're right.
It's unbelievable.
So I think the notion of making your own yogurt or getting a yogurt that's high fat, and you can almost never find high fat yogurt. Go on the shelf, and product after product, getting back to what you said earlier, excuse me, is low fat yogurt. Why don't want low fat yogurt? That's about, that again is, it's military intelligence. It's not necessarily the way we want to go. So we want high fat, want to give our bodies fat. Gosh, here's a plug for somebody, make high-fat, high-fiber yogurt. What an idea. You heard it first, with prebiotic fiber in the yogurt. Oh my gosh, that'd be great. So it's well beyond taking a very powerful probiotic, which are out there. That's a good move. That's terrific. But then once that's within your gut, you got to give those bacteria what they need. You got to nurture them with prebiotic fiber. That's what they need to live.
It's the first thing, I was telling you this earlier, I've been in the fitness business for 20 years. People come to me initially for an aesthetic change, and I almost trick them into trying to heal them internally. I'm not a doctor, but there's specific low-hanging fruit items that we can go after that really makes an impact on their life. The first, I think, 2 questions that I ask them is about sleep and whether they're taking a probiotic or not, or how regular they are, just trying to get into the gut health a little bit. And they're almost looking at me going, what's the workout program? What do we have to do? What's your sleep? That'd be the other one, probably a three-way tie. People don't realize how terrible they feel until you start cleaning up specific things in their life for a period of time. It's incredible to me to see them go. We didn't even cover this topic today. I know we don't have enough time, but gluten, wheat, and how if you remove that from someone's diet for roughly 60 to 90 days, and how their brain clarity improves, how their energy level improves. I see things in their skin, a bounce in their step, and then suddenly reintroducing that into their diet. And I like doing that because I like to show them, see what you feel like. Oh my God, I feel awful. Last night, for the first time in probably a year, I had like a small can of diet ginger ale, which I don't drink diet soda.
Wow.
But we were having a dinner at my family's house. It was something they called Pumpkin Day. They make me like a special dish on the side, and there was a diet ginger ale, and I drank it. It was like this big, and I woke up this morning, and for some reason there was a fogginess over me. Now, is that good or bad? Because I had one ginger ale, and I wake up and I actually have a slight feeling of being hungover, which I can tell. That's how in tune with my body I am. But there's a reason why I walk around and I really don't need to drink this. My energy level is always really good, and I feel like my recovery is really good, and I can go because my car engine's operating the way that it needs to operate. But clean up a couple things. The lowest hanging fruit is doctor formulated probiotic by Garden of Life, and you honestly have, and it could get, for someone coming in for the first time, you have different strains. You have different focuses. I know you have one more for mood and prostate, and you have all these different. Is it really strains, or is it more like agents in there that can target and focus on those?
Well, each product has additives based upon what we're trying to accomplish, and there are various strains depending on what we're trying to accomplish, but additives as well. Ashwagandha added to the mood probiotic, for example. We have additives in the prostate formula that are clinically proven. One is called Flowens. It's a cranberry extract that's clinically proven to improve urinary function in men. But I think that no one's perfect, and I wouldn't beat yourself up for having a diet ginger ale.
I'll live.
Yeah, you'll live, but beyond that, you know what? You have to weigh that versus, you really enjoyed the heck out of it, I bet.
It was nice.
There you go. I mean, no one's gonna.
It was nice.
No one's gonna argue with that. So, I guess it gets to a point, but I think people have to understand that the reason we argue against the 100% plan is because when people fall off once, they said, done, I messed up, I'm finished with that. You're allowed to slip once in a while.
It's part of the plan, I like to say. It's part of the plan to slip. So if you slip, that's part of the 20% rule, or however we want to start. The 3 supplements that I send people to are your MCT, your probiotic, and your magnesium. So those are really the 3 things in my life that I take consistently, and it's made a world of change. So I know we're probably close to the hour right now. I mean, I would love to do this again one day because you're like a world of knowledge, and it's really a thrill for me and Derek to have you in here. So
I'm delighted.
Thank you so much.
It's great.
It's really been amazing. But if someone wants to learn about the ketogenic diet, they go to drperlmutter.com.
Correct.
Social media handles, pages, if someone wants to.
Facebook is David Perlmutter MD.
Okay.
And Instagram is, what's Instagram? That's that thing where you... David Perlmutter. And Twitter. I don't do a lot of Twitter. For whatever reason, I'm not saying that people who do Twitter, I
don't do a lot of Twitter.
No.
There's no pictures, so I guess But Dr. Perlmutter, obviously you guys know how I feel about him, and he's really the Babe Ruth of this category. And if you're not following him, start following him, and hopefully we can do this again soon. So thank you so much.
My
Such an honor.
pleasure.
Really,
Great.
really,
My
really,
pleasure.
really.
It's great.
Thanks,
Thank
Derek.
you.
Thank you.